Why does everyone work so many hours just to make a living, and who can change this situation? You can't survive on service jobs, even though they increase the amount of money that passes from one person to another. Manufacturing jobs are those that enable service jobs to exist. Let's say that on an imaginary island, everyone would offer paid advice via Facebook in various areas, from cooking to fashion. In such a situation, the island dwellers wouldn't survive very long, because nobody would be producing anything. They wouldn't have clean drinking water or shelter from the cold or food in order to not starve to death. Despite this, there is a significant increase in service jobs, both in terms of absolute number and in terms of their overall proportion in the industry. Immediately after the close of the Second World War, employment in the service industry was only about 30% higher than in the production industry. In 1970, the number of workers in the service industry was already 2.2 times higher than in the production industry, and by 2005, the service industry had 5 times the number of workers than the production industry. The problem is that it is almost impossible to export services as a substitute for goods produced in other countries. Almost every home in America has at least one television made in China, but only a tiny fraction of children in China will watch American TV series, and a German citizen will not travel to the United States for surgery. The reason that the production industry replaced the service industry in the United States was initially due to issues related to regulation, taxes, and professional unions, alongside intervention on the part of the American Central Bank. For example, in a YouTube clip called "Regulated to Death," John Stossel demonstrated how regulation and bureaucracy is involved in setting up a lemonade stand. He claimed that if he would legally open a lemonade stand, the process would take at least 65 days. The difficulty of trade based on services resulted in the creation of trade deficits. The first trade deficits developed in 1976. In the 70s and 80s, US trade deficits were 10 to 50 million per year. In the 90s, trade deficit reached $100 million per year. The US trade deficits were paid by the acquisition of assets in the United States by the manufacturing countries. In addition, the deficit was paid in dollars. The problem is that since it is not linked to gold, the dollar can be printed or created by the government and the banks. The reason that the sellers agreed to accept the dollar is that it represents a reserve currency in which international trade takes place. If the dollar was not a reserve currency, its value would depreciate since it would not be possible to buy very much with it. Towards 2001, the US government, instead of reducing regulation and preventing any further erosion of the dollar, chose to encourage consumption at the expense of production. The encouragement of consumption was achieved by the US Federal Reserve, setting a low interest rate of 2%. Encouraging additional consumption caused a further decrease in production. Money at any given time is limited, and if the money is directed toward a business in the service industry, it's taken away from a business in the area of production. It's more lucrative to establish a consulting firm for mortgage recycling than it is to found a factory for the production of television sets. As a result of the reduction in interest rates in 2001, the trade deficit rose to $600 billion per year over the first decade of the current century. This is equivalent to approximately $2,000 per US resident, including children, each year. Service jobs usually pay lower wages than production jobs. Of course, there are some jobs that pay well, but the majority of jobs in the service industry are for waiters or cashiers at fast food chains. It is therefore not surprising that according to the Canadian Bureau of Statistics, a production worker earns twice as much as a service worker. On the other hand, the percentage of the population that is employed and the amount of time devoted to working is on the rise. According to the Pew Research Center, between 1960 and 2010, the employment market in the United States changed from one provider to two providers. The transition of the American economy from a production to a service industry had additional effects, such as, according to the Bureau of Economics, income from private savings decreased over the years. From 1960 to the mid-80s, income from private savings was nearly always in the double digits. This dropped to single digits, with a negative peak in July 2005 at a savings income of 1.9%. According to the Bureau of Economics, regulations on construction and the low interest rates caused real estate prices to rise. The median price of apartments rose from $17,200 in January 1963 to $320,000 in April 2016. This is an increase larger than the rise in wages and inflation. The trend of rising prices and the erosion in revenue can be detected in many other types of data, such as the rise in personal debt. Meaning, while the head of the family in the 1960s was able to support himself and his family as a single provider working in production, today, he and his wife together will find it difficult to support their children while working what will most likely be a service job. For this reason, an economy based on service jobs cannot allow wealth expressed as high availability of consumer goods such as apartments, cars, and food, as well as low working hours in all households. So, what should the US government do to ensure that there will be a significant improvement in manufacturing output over the years, which will cause a reduction in individual and family working hours? First, the US government should substantially reduce the regulation of employment conditions, especially those regarding the employer's ability to fire workers and those that define accepted salaries. Second, the US government should reduce the supervision of businesses to a minimum. This means that the government should not busy itself with topics such as how many toilets a business has, or what the height of the warehouse ceiling is. Third, the Fed, or the Central Bank of the United States, must stop interfering with interest rates and the quantity of money in circulation. This will allow the market to determine the interest rate and create a balance between the production and consumption industries. In my personal assessment, a large proportion of the service professions are unnecessary and will disappear if the principles I mentioned are implemented. For example, bureaucratic government positions that require a general bachelor's degree as a condition for employment will disappear, as will many other service jobs. The number of service jobs will plummet, allowing a higher standard of living and far fewer working hours per household. Of course, the control of the central bank over interest rates in the United States and around the world is a social phenomenon that we don't usually consider. I'll talk more about them in my next videos. Interesting stuff? Sign up for our newsletter and get more original content.